Let me tell you how this started. I'll make this story short and sweet. It's a funny story, I think. The museum has been associated with Gunnar since the 1930s, since the 1920s, really. We've done a number of exhibits of his work, as you'll see when you look at the timeline on the website. And in January of 2010, we had an exhibit of his work up in the Lockett Gallery. It was a large exhibit. There were about 45 paintings or so in that exhibit. And it was a very cold, very wintry, snowy January Saturday. I remember it very well. And I was working on something at my computer, and it was kind of being wintry outdoors. And I got a telephone call, and the voice at the other end said, "Hello, this is Gunnar Widforss," in a very thick Swedish accent. Obviously, it grabbed my attention immediately. Now, I knew that there was a Gunnar Widforss from the family who was in the present day generation because he had visited Bruce Aiken at Roaring Springs 20 years ago or so. So that's who I thought it was. But it turned out that there's another Gunnar Widforss. There are two Gunnar Widforses in the present day generation. And Gunnar, he had seen the notice about the exhibit on our website. And he said he had a number of paintings that he'd like to sell. And could I help him sell those paintings? And I kind of diplomatically said, well, yeah, sort of, a little bit, maybe. Simply because it's sort of an ethically gray zone for a curator to help in a way like that. So I said, but send me pictures of your paintings and I'll see, what the current values are like, and we can kind of play it by ear, okay? So, but it immediately piqued my interest because I really had no idea, what his work sold for and what Gunnar could maybe expect for his paintings. So I went to an online art database called Ask Art, and I downloaded about 150 auction records that I spent far too long formatting to put into a spreadsheet so I could look at the values of the paintings. And the second that I pasted all that into the spreadsheet and it kind of all percolated down the page, I realized nobody's ever done this. I knew nobody had ever done it because in working on the exhibition, it was painfully apparent that nobody was doing any research or writing about Gunnar, aside from very small exceptions. And in the next second, I just said, somebody's got to do this. And the next second, I said, I've got to do this. And that's how this project started. It was a very, very spontaneous decision that brought about by this very, I don't think it's random, but by this phone call from Gunnar, who by this time has become a very good friend of mine. So that's how this all started. And I think that this might be more of a closing statement than an opening statement, but I think that one of the wonderful things about working on this project has been getting to know Gunnar's family and just how sweet and supportive and interested they've been in this project. So this is Gunnar, 4 photos from different periods in his lifetime. And Gunnar was a true bohemian, meaning that he basically followed his muse. He sought beautiful landscapes to paint, and everything else was pretty much secondary to him. He was also extremely self-critical of his own work, and he rarely acknowledged that a painting came out good, which, if you know his work, is pretty ironic. So he came from a large family, and not all of these children had children, but it's interesting to note that in the present day generation, there are a large number of artists and performing artists. There are genes from his mother's side. This is his mother, Blenda, on the right over here. His father, Moritz, who I wish I could have met all of them. And if you have kids, just looking at the twinkle in his eye, you can imagine that he was probably a little troublesome. He was the 3rd child. And I can only imagine. So Gunnar went to school in Stockholm, the same art school that his mother went to. She was an accomplished amateur painter. And in 1905, he set off to journey in Europe to paint. He had flirted with starting a painting business in Stockholm, He went so far as to buy a business license, and that's as far as that went. So each color represents his track in a different year. And I don't want to go into too many details here. There are a number of locations that he heavily favored. He really favored the French Riviera, as you'll see. He went to Venice a number of times. He spent many summers in the Tyrolean Alps. He basically focused on popular tourist destinations or scenic areas where there are health spas, because he knew that he could sell paintings there. And that's and he probably got that idea from talking to other, working artists. So he had a great business plan, but he was never terribly good with money. He made good money, but he often shared it with his friends, and ironically, he was frequently in debt much of his life. Always, working to sell artwork to pay off his debts. So here's a painting so I'm going to show you a few paintings, and then we'll and a few friends of his, and then we'll go to the catalog. So this is a really, to use a colloquial phrase, a really killer painting done in 1912. 1912 was kind of his crux year. It was also the year that he had two paintings accepted into the Paris Salon, so that makes sense. But 1912 is really when kind of everything came together, and he really hit his first real high mark technically in terms of his painting technique and his subject matter. Menton is a town on the French Riviera, not far from Monte Carlo, and he spent a lot of time there, and he sold a lot of artwork there. And he would occasionally go back to Sweden, not on any regular basis, but he usually made it up there most years, during the summers especially. And of course, during the First World War, he was actually in Austria just a month before the First World War started. But he maybe got intimations of what was going down, and he headed back to Stockholm in June of 1914. Which was great, because he wound up doing a lot of really important work in and around Stockholm that year. This isn't one of his best paintings from that time period, but it's a really important painting because there's great documentation of it. And that turned out to be a really happy circumstance for a number of paintings in the catalog. This is an article. It's just kind of a public interest article that was published in a couple of Stockholm papers. And that's him working on that painting. So the article says, and it's a pretty loose translation, but for the past few days, a young outdoor painter has attracted considerable attention from strolling Stockholmers, especially the boys' running team. The young painter has set up his easel in a place where he is easily observed, namely the middle of the new Kungsholm Bridge, and that's this bridge, unperturbed by the noisy traffic that presses close to the narrow walkway where the artist can be found. Night after night, he paints Riddarholm's port, that is the subject on the side of the opposite side of the harbor, in the evening sunlight. Every day, interest grows in his art among the public. But soon the painting will be finished, and then the bustling commuters from the shops and offices who usually follow the development of the artist's work will seek out some other interesting point in Stockholm's life. So this was really an amazing find. And in fact, the Gunnar who called me that snowy January has this particular painting. One of the most important and beautiful bodies within his work are paintings done in the Swedish archipelago. And this is one of the best examples of that particular set of work. And it's interesting that his whole career, Gunnar was swimming upstream against the tide of modernism. Keep in mind in 1913, Picasso and Braque had just kind of finished the initial phase of their work in Cubism, so-called analytical Cubism. And in 1913 was when that famous Armory show took place in New York City, just to kind of create some context. And in the late 19th century, Sweden had kind of undergone sort of a reimagining, a reshaping of Swedish society and Swedish self-identity, seeking connection with their past, and kind of bringing that into the modern world. And I think that Gunnar was he wasn't directly following that or directly involved with it, but I think that to some conscious degree, and certainly to some subconscious degree, a lot of his landscapes like this from this time really kind of echo that what's referred to as the national romantic movement, because nature and the landscape of Sweden is so vitally, and that's like in capital letters, bolded, italicized, all of that is so vitally important to the Swedish people. And he really brought out he really captured some of the best aspects of the Swedish landscape and reflecting that kind of national romantic movement. And he did so also in an entirely different body of work that featured old buildings in Stockholm, like this one from 1916. He initially did a set of these in 1908, and he did another set in 1912, and then further studies like this one in 1916. And some, but not all, but this one, for example, contrast old buildings with new buildings that were just being built. And I think that he was doing this out of, sort of a nostalgic, sentimental perspective, but also trying to capture and preserve the past of Stockholm, while all the, bustling new construction was going on. And you can see the subject matter is, for a lot of people, maybe mundane, but you can see that his color and his drawing is just, Gunnar all the way. And then what I love about these is that they are historical records of these neighborhoods that were, soon after torn down and replaced with modern new buildings like the one that you can see in the background here. And one of the really awesome things about Stockholm, among many awesome things about Stockholm, is that the city maintains a database of historic photographs and maps and documents. And so when you browse the catalog with some of these old, paintings of old buildings in Stockholm, I was able to locate historical photos of the exact subject, which just, for me, was just, icing on the cake, and really super exciting to find. So there's a whole, like I said, a whole set of these older buildings in Stockholm. And of course, when he came to the United States, he began to get really solid recognition for his work. And that came from his meeting with a number of Park Service administrators, but it was really his meeting with Stephen Mather in the winter of 1923 that set him off on the course that led him to become known as the painter of the national parks. And the sad thing about Gunnar is that he was pretty darn well known in the 1920s and 30s. But like I said, because he was professionally swimming upstream against modernism, and of course after the Armory show in 1913, professional artists in America just really wanted to become modern in a really bad way. So he wasn't left behind, but he was definitely not part of the avant-garde ever. And that's what, scholars tend to focus on. So it was Stephen Mather who, suggested that he focus on the national parks. Well, the quote is, so this is a letter to Francis Farquhar, who was a historical writer in California and a Sierra Nevada mountaineer. And Gunnar wrote, though I have heard hundreds of times about that place, the Grand Canyon, it surpasses all imagination. I suppose you know it from the South Rim. Nothing I ever saw has impressed me in any way in comparison. Simply wonderful. And I'm sure that the future will give me opportunity to paint there as much as I'd like. And then, a list of the national parks that he worked in. So Stephen Mather would have been delighted to meet Gunnar because Gunnar's style was really appropriate for marketing Mather's vision of the national parks, which is a really wonderful whole other story in itself. And of course, Gunnar saw dollar signs in the relationship. Mather introduced him to, other important Park Service administrators and future patrons, and that sort of thing. So here's a really great photograph of Gunnar at work at Mesa Verde. He visited Mesa Verde a couple of times in 1925 and 1926. And of course, you can't do this anymore, right? But the photograph, not sure who took it, the photograph captures Gunnar working on the painting here on the left. You can, if you look closely at the photograph, you can just make out the light and dark features found in the painting. So he's basically looking through this little window over here, over his right shoulder and painting. I'm not sure why he's not facing it, but. And the thing about Gunnar was that, and maybe you have friends like this, he was a smoker and a drinker. There's no question about that. When he was about 25, he wrote to his mother from Switzerland. He wrote, have cut down on my smoking have cut down to 20 or 30 a day. Just for a little perspective. But he could hike out from Phantom Ranch to the South Rim in 3 hours. So I would take that. And he did like to drink, but he was adventurous, and he did a number of paintings from inside the Grand Canyon. And this is one of his best examples from Plateau Point. Just an absolutely stellar painting. So what is a catalogue raisonne? It literally means a reasoned catalog, meaning that you can create that catalog in any way that the author desires, based on the artist who's being cataloged. And I followed pretty standard guidelines, but one of the things that I wanted to do for Gunnar's catalog was to include a large amount of ephemeral materials like postcards and menus from Yosemite, because in the 1920s in particular, a large number of his paintings were reproduced for commercial purposes. He sold 8 paintings to the Santa Fe Railroad, which were used for promotional brochures and advertisements and that sort of thing. So we'll come back to the catalog in a little bit. So if you like numbers, and if you like imagining the amount of work that went into this, I shot at least 5,000 photographs. One of the current family members has 350 letters that Gunnar wrote to his mother. And those letters are really, they're repetitive in many ways because he was writing to his mother. So he often comments on the weather, and he comments on how his work is going, which is good, but he never talks about the really juicy stuff. But nonetheless, those letters are, probably the most important, record of his activity. So currently the catalog has 1,262 records for paintings, almost 200 records of archival and ephemeral material, a bibliography with more than 180 records. And I had the great pleasure of meeting 18 current family members, who I'll introduce you to a few in a minute, and thousands of miles of travel. One of the most fun things I enjoyed doing was finding his subjects and comparing his paintings with those subjects. And if you're not terribly familiar with his work, Gunnar was an incredibly accurate draftsman. I mean, I can't say that emphatically enough. This is a church in Zurich, his painting from 1904 on the left, and then a photograph that I shot in 2015. And another subject in Switzerland, just outside of Lugano, if you've ever had the pleasure of visiting Lugano. It's a small walkway and a village cross, and the white rectangle over here outlines his drawing of the scene. So it's always very exciting to be able to locate these types of subjects. So I want to introduce you just to a small handful of family members because they've been so just wonderful. I can't even say that enough. This is Peter, and Peter is Gunnar's grandson. And Peter is probably as unlike Gunnar as, as somebody could be. He's a colonel in the Swedish army. He basically works in procurement, equipment and things like that. This is Ulla, who is a grandniece. And you can see just on her wall, there are about a half a dozen paintings. The large painting here, it was done by Gunnar's mother. and it's a copy of an 18th century Dutch painting. This is Anita and Anders, and Anita is a grandniece. She has a collection of about 20 paintings or so. When Gunnar died, the executors of his estate tried to sell the paintings, but that was from 1934 to 1937. Not the darkest days of the Great Depression, but definitely not a time when a lot of people were buying artwork. So most of Gunnar's estate of 200 paintings or so was sent back to the family, and then they were distributed, amongst the various nieces and nephews at that time. This is Carl, and Carl Olof. Carl Olof was an architect. He just passed away last year, sadly. And Carl was sort of the archivist. He was taking care of that box of letters that Gunnar wrote to his mother, and he had about 180 paintings in his closet, most of which were unfinished. But that was a very long day photographing all of those paintings. This is Ulle on the left. He's a nephew, and whenever I'm in Stockholm, I go bike riding with Ulle. So a book that you can read about Gunnar, in addition to the Belknap book if you're interested, is called The Art of Flight, written by Frederick. So when I began working on the exhibit in 1909, I didn't know yet about Frederick's book, which was also only out in Swedish at that time. But it's an interesting book. Frederick is a very popular writer in Sweden. He's kind of like the David Quammen of Sweden. He writes a lot about natural sciences and with a very unique perspective, I'll put it that way. And Frederick has been an immense help to me and inspiration. So his book came out in English, I think it was last year. So it is available in English today. And I'd be interested, if you read it, I'd be interested in your perspective on it. And then finally, Gunnar, who got me into this. Gunnar's a big game hunter, and he goes to South Africa, not every year, but pretty regularly, and he hunts moose in northern Sweden. And he's a wonderful fellow, and has, as I mentioned, has become a very dear friend. And I think with that, we'll go take a look at the catalog, okay? You can access the catalog from the museum's website. So if you go to the, under research, if you go down to fine art, you come to this page, and you can access the catalog from this link. The catalog has been produced using software called Panopticon. Panopticon is out of New York City, and they've produced catalogs for Paul Cézanne, Mary Cassatt, Sam Francis, many, many other really big names, far better known than Gunnar. And my favorite one, and I mentioned this in the most recent newsletter that I'm going to send out. Actually, you can access the newsletter now here on the website. Is the Fitzhugh Lane catalog. Anyway, the Fitzhugh Lane catalog is a remarkable, absolutely remarkable publication, and I would urge you to maybe spend a little time looking at that too. So anyway, the people at Panopticon have been stellar. Susanna Shepard, who's done the programming and the overall styling of the website, has been a pleasure to work with, and has done a stellar job with it, I think. So this is the opening page. There are a number of pages about Gunnar and about the catalog. There's a biography, and there's a pretty comprehensive timeline of Gunnar's life and career. And I'm not going to, show you too much of this. And I know what it's like watching somebody else scroll through a web page. So I won't bore you with too much of that. But for each year of his career, I've got a representative painting and interesting historical circumstances from that year. This is a pretty fun place to spend some time, I think. This is actually one of my favorite paintings of his. This is a Stockholm Harbor in the wintertime. It's only a small painting. It's about 5 by 7 inches, but it's so wintry. I just love it. So there's a fun timeline you can browse through. Let's see. All of the newsletters that I've sent out over the past several years are available here now. Number 7, newsletter 7 is the most recent. I'll be emailing that out tomorrow, but you can access that from the museum's website now. Well, I wanted to mention too that the first time that you visit the website and land on the home page, you'll be asked to register as a user, but all you have to do is enter your email address, and it'll keep a cookie for you so that you only have to enter your email address once. And I'm not going to send you any spam from that. So the catalog itself consists of the catalog of paintings, the catalog of ephemeral material, a list of collections where Gunnar's paintings are found, exhibitions that he took part in both during his lifetime and during the present day, and then a large list of paintings that we don't know where they are today. There's also an extensive bibliography and a selected bibliography. I'll just start there with a list of 24 books that I think are probably the most important ones that include a discussion of Gunnar and his work. So the catalog itself, like I said, currently contains 1,200 works. Excuse me. And it's interesting to point out too, so kind of an aside, there are works that aren't published because in the course of doing this research, and this is the case with all catalogs Raisonne, you know, I ran across work that was clearly not his, clearly not his. And somebody had forged his signature. You know, I don't know if some amateur artist was trying to, you know, ride on Gunnar's coattails or whatever the circumstances were. You know, we'll never really know, I don't think. But there are about a dozen paintings that I didn't want to include just because they're clearly not his. But I do have them cataloged because there's, within that dozen paintings or so, there's a set of about 5 or 6 that were done by the same artist, I think. And in fact, I bought one of those. I've got one in the hallway out here. Just because I thought it was interesting to see, you know, what was being passed around. And it's not that some of them might not be Gunnar's, but he didn't really experiment that much, I think. There are some of his works in the catalog that are, you know, a little bit different, but he, you know, once he kind of found his style, he pretty much stuck with it. So the catalog's organized chronologically, and it starts with some of his earliest paintings. This is one of my favorite early ones. This is, he did an apprenticeship in St. Petersburg, Russia for about 1.5 years, which he absolutely hated. His boss was mean and didn't hardly pay him, and he was doing decorative work. He was doing what today we would refer to as faux finishing, and, you know, painting, you know, like gold leafing on window frames and that sort of stuff. Really, you know, expensive work, murals, you know, that sort of thing. And I love this painting because it's a little clumsy, but it records his time there. It's a market scene, you know, on the streets in St. Petersburg. And what's especially nice about it is he referred to it in a letter home to his mother. So each catalog entry, you know, has what we call the provenance, or the history of ownership of this painting. And it's actually still in the family. And then on many works, not all of them, but on many works, I have a note about the circumstances of the painting, other interesting historical circumstances. Let's go to southern France. So you can search from this area, and there's also another there's a more detailed search function available up here too. So here are about a dozen paintings that he did in Menton on the French Riviera. Here's the one that I showed you earlier. And here's an especially nice one. I've often showed this painting in slide talks about Gunnar. So you can see that there's detailed information about the ownership, the provenance. It's only been exhibited once in an exhibition in 2018 in Sweden. and then a bibliography for that painting, the published references. And then the next tab has a little information about the painting, and like I said, he spent a lot of time in Menton. And then where possible, I've included archival material like this postcard of a view from pretty much the same scene. You know, whether it's the same tree or not, I don't think that it is. But one of his unfinished paintings is an unfinished painting of this particular tree. So there's two different versions of it. So let's come to the Grand Canyon, since I think we all love the Grand Canyon. So out of the 1,200 paintings, more than 200 are of the Grand Canyon. Here's an unfinished one. And here is the very first painting that Gunnar ever did of the Grand Canyon. It's unfortunately pretty faded, but I found this painting. I maintain a search on a lot of auction websites, including eBay. And in May of 2012, this came up in eBay. And I immediately recognized it because there was a photograph of it in Gunnar's scrapbook. So Gunnar maintained a pretty prolific scrapbook. And so I was able to glean a lot of information about some paintings from there. And in his scrapbook was this photograph of that painting. And he recorded my first picture of Grand Canyon, which, well, first of all, when I saw that, it was like, oh my gosh, yes, thank you, Gunnar. And he did this in late July of 1923. He had been painting in Zion and decided, well, like that quote from the letter to Francis Farquhar, he decided to take a break and go paint at Grand Canyon, which he had never done. And what's amazing about this painting is, first of all, the fact that it exists. And apparently before it went on eBay, it belonged to a woman back in, I think it was Illinois or Indiana. What's amazing about this is that for any artist going to paint a new subject, whether it's the Grand Canyon or downtown Flagstaff, it doesn't matter. You know, it takes an artist a little while to become acquainted and to get to know a subject. And Gunnar just hit it spot on. And he didn't go for kind of a zoomed in view of Brahma and Zoroaster, the subjects of this painting. He didn't just zoom in on that and say, yeah, let me see what I can do with this. He went for the whole enchilada. He went for the big North Rim view. And I think that says something about his confidence in his drawing ability, even though, like I said earlier, he was very self-critical, but he had the confidence to jump right into that painting, which just never ceases to astound me. The following year, he did this painting of the same scene. And fortunately, this one's not as faded. This is currently in the collection of the Swedish National Museum. In 1925, Stephen Mather bought this from Gunnar, and he gave it to the Swedish Crown Prince as a gift when the prince was visiting. Actually, it was 1926, sorry, when the Crown Prince was visiting America. So this is now in the Swedish National Museum. It had never been exhibited from the time that it arrived there, which tells you, kind of the classic story about museum collections. So woefully few of the total, makeup of a museum's collection actually goes on exhibit. This was not ever exhibited until the exhibit in Sweden in 2018. And again, if we look at the entry for it, we've got the provenance, and it was in his 1924 exhibit in Washington, D.C. And then a list of the bibliographic references and historical photos. Let's go to the archives. So when the Swedish Crown Prince, Gustav, and his wife Louise came to America in 1926, it was a huge news story. I mean, when I was doing research, I couldn't believe people, newspapers, journalists just went gaga about this story. They made a big trip through the United States, visited a lot of national parks. And this is the Prince and Louisa and a number of important Park Service officials. And I don't think Gunnar was there at Mesa Verde, but he met up with them at the Grand Canyon and then later at Yosemite National Park. The archives include a lot of historical photos. Here's Gunnar painting in the Sierra Nevada mountains, kind of near where the minarets are in Mount Banner. And again, wherever possible, I link together different artifacts, different archival material about his travels and his work. For example, this map that shows his route. On the second day of the trip, his horse stepped on Gunnar's foot, and Gunnar refused to get back on the horse and walked the rest of the way. So in the archives, there are a lot of historical photos. This is probably the last photo taken of Gunnar on the South Rim with a painting that's in the Belknap book. This is a view looking up the Pipe Creek drainage, kind of just below the main area on the South Rim. But he's looking a little elderly there, although he's only 55, but his lifestyle began to take its toll. But then, we can sort these. Each neighborhood of the catalog can be filtered and sorted as well as searched. And we have a lot of postcards. And not only postcards, do you remember the Village Cross? So unbelievably, in Lugano, I found a postcard of that cross and almost the exact same view that Gunnar was painting. So I have postcards that are, kind of documentary in nature. For Grand Canyon fans, here's a view of Hermit Camp, which he did do a painting of. A whole set of Yosemite postcards, a set of 12 postcards made from his paintings. And then a whole set of Grand Canyon postcards made from his work. So this postcard set coincided with the opening of Desert View Watchtower in 1933. There's, again, I think it's a set of 10. And several of them feature the watchtower, including, there's the famous fireplace at Hermit's Rest, and then a view, and this is kind of a quirky one, but a view looking through one of the windows in the watchtower out towards the Chuar Butte and the Palisades of the desert. So I can spend a long time showing you a lot of things here, but I think that you'll get much more out of it if you explore yourselves. Amelia, if you want to open it up to questions. So Janet asked, am I planning another Widforss exhibit? Yes, when I finish the monograph, and that'll probably be a couple of more years. I'd like to think it's going to go quickly, but you know how these things go. So yes, yeah, probably in the next couple of years. What surprised me the most? Boy, that's a great question, and actually something that I think about often. And now that I'm in front of an audience, I don't know if I can think of an answer to that question. What surprised me is how he could go from, well, the paintings I showed you from Sweden, the view of the archipelago and then the old building downtown. The fact that he could treat such entirely different subjects so equally, in such an equally captivating way. And to take a subject like the old buildings in Stockholm and make them into something that you want to look at and explore. And not surprising, but a great example of that would be when he first came to Yosemite in 1921. So like I said, I think he really kind of reached, I'm not going to say a plateau, but he reached a significant level in his work in 1912. And I think another significant trip for him was when he went to Tunisia in 1919 and 1920, because he fell in love with the desert. But a year after that, actually it was later that year, December of 1920, when he came to the United States the second time. And, you know, he would have probably known about Yosemite, but he was really, when he came to the United States, he was really on his way to Japan. And he wound up staying here because he ran out of money. So, I mean, within 4 days after he got off the train in Los Angeles, he found a popular tourist destination, Mount Lowe, just outside of Pasadena, which is right next to where Mount Wilson Observatory is. And he spent 2 weeks painting there, cranked out some paintings, made some cash, went to Catalina Island, painted there for a month, got some inventory, and he certainly would have learned, and so he was probably thinking, I'm off to Japan. But for whatever reason, he was attracted to the artist colony in Carmel and Monterey. And so he went up the coast to Carmel, and within another week or so, he'd gone to Yosemite. And I think that when he went to Yosemite, he was still referring about going on to Japan, but I think that he was just captivated because I think he liked that challenge. I think he was really driven to push himself. And when he got to Yosemite, and then 2 years later to the Grand Canyon, it was kind of like this kind of collective momentum that just pushed him to this whole other level of ability and vision and aesthetics, I would say. And it was like he found these subjects that were just made for him, just made for him. And so, again, that wasn't really surprising, but I think that that's one of the biggest, well, it's not a moment, but biggest things that happened to him, I guess I would say. In terms of kind of being at a certain level, and and you've probably all experienced that, right? Professionally or personally, where it's kind of like you're feeling pretty comfortable with your tool set, and then all of a sudden your boss or somebody says, "Hey, what about this?" And that's what this was for me. That's what this project was for me, I would say. And you just kind of go, "Oh, ay, ay." Now that's what I said when Gunnar called me. I went, "Ay, ay, ay, ay." Okay, let's do this. And I think that's what Gunnar did. Carol, do I have a favorite painting? I probably have 20. I like some of those paintings from Menton. I love the Swedish paintings. I love the Stockholm paintings. But I also love, the Yosemite and Grand Canyon paintings. The painting from Plateau Point that I showed you is just another killer painting. I mean, it's so magnificent. It would be really hard for me to pick a single one. Let me think about that for a minute, though, if I can. Tim, what's your comment?
Alan, I'd just like to thank you for a brilliant presentation, and I believe this project was the result of, 10 years work, is it, since 2000?
It's been 10 years, yeah.
I have a question of what was the company you said did the final construction of the interface?
Panopticon.
Panopticon. They did a brilliant job.
She was just absolutely one of the finest programmers. I've done database programming too, and web portals for databases.
Right.
And Susanna is just brilliant.
So how did you yourself assemble all of the moving parts that became this wonderfully designed interface over the 10 years, out of curiosity?
Well, it began as a FileMaker Pro database. and in retrospect, I would have set it up quite a bit differently. The exporting of it went well, but it could have gone a lot smoother if I had kind of been thinking a little bit more in advance. But basically, she just took my tables and put them in their tables, and she was able to reestablish the links I had between objects and documents and that sort of thing in FileMaker, which were all pretty much broken when they were imported. And after that, it was just a matter of me going through. I've probably been through each of the 1,200 records. I can't tell you how many times, but basically just going through and plugging the pieces together. And then the icing on the cake, though, is once the mechanics were put together, the icing on the cake was going through and putting all the archival photographs and documents and letters together with the paintings that they belonged with. I don't consider myself a type A personality necessarily, but as I've told so many people so many times, I mean, I wish I had nothing else to do, because you can just really, dive into this.
The organizational expertise that you showed in assembling it, enabled the construction of a really wonderful final product.
Well, thanks.
Thank you again.
Dave asked the question, are there other catalogs Raisonne of Gunnar's work? No, and usually there is just one for an individual artist, because it's it's sort of the official document of their career. That said, though, with some artists, like in the case, so I think that with Paul Cézanne, there is, or it might be somebody else, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's at least one artist where there are 2 or 3 different catalogs, one addressing paintings, one addressing drawings, and it can be broken out like that. And that kind of goes back to my original comment about the fact that it's reasoned, the original concept for this kind of document, meaning that the author can organize it however they wish and emphasize, whatever they wish. Which I was happy for, because I I don't like rules that much. So the answer is no. But it is a living document, and the beauty of doing it online. I mean, so previously these would be printed books, like that thick. I have a Catalogue Raisonne of George Albert Burr's prints. As soon as you print that, it's out of date, because I'm anticipating that over the next few months, I'm going to get, a deluge of emails saying, oh, I've got one of those, that sort of thing. So the beauty of being online is it can be updated in, 5 minutes, and it's always up to date. And it's also freely accessible. To buy a Catalogue Raisonne like that would be hundreds of dollars, in a print version. Yeah, it's if you like this kind of this kind of documentation, I have to say it's just a great thing to dive into and spend time with. And for me, it really helped kind of put me in the mindset of the 19-teens, the 1920s, and the 1930s, because artists are mirrors of their era, and I think that more than they realize, artists tell us about their subjects in ways that they can't really consciously comprehend. They're conduits. And I think that, especially with his work in the United States, his paintings about the national parks, Gunnar is a conduit to the time when Stephen Mather, who was a great marketing guy, that's the thing about Stephen Mather, he knew how to sell stuff, but he was struggling with how to sell the national parks. And he finally came up with ways to do that, and Gunnar was one of those vehicles. And I just think it's kind of, for me, really great to be able to kind of be immersed in that whole milieu, from that time period. One of the greatest things I did was going through a lot of newspapers from the 20s and 30s. So one of the surprising things, and I guess it's about time, one of the surprising things was looking through newspapers from the 1920s, especially, how aviation and cars were such a big deal. Every issue of a newspaper, every edition of a newspaper had stories about airplanes and cars.
Actually, this is a really good opportunity for one question that I think you might have missed. Chris Lynn asked, what were the family memories of Gunnar? And then
yeah. I saw that. I'm sorry I missed that.
Story of him that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so, okay, here's a story. It's a great story, and there are a lot. When Gunnar came to the United States in 1921, he only went back to visit Sweden twice, once in 1928 and once in 1930. And in 1930, Karl Olof was 8 years old, and he remembered meeting Gunnar. When Swedes would return home, they were seen as returning heroes. They had gone to the United States, which had a little bit different reputation than we do right now. And they were greeted as people who'd gone to this golden land, been successful, and come home. And it was a big deal. It was a really big deal. Because a lot of 1/3 of Sweden emigrated in the 1880s because of failed agriculture. Anyway, so Karl Olof met Gunnar when he was 8 years old. And he remembered walking and holding Gunnar's hand and talking about the United States. And he was the only direct link with Gunnar at that time, which I just think is really a pretty great story.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. If there's no other questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you to each of our members for participating. It was wonderful to have all of you here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.